Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hey friends, welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and together we are walking through the New Testament in a year. Currently, we are studying 1 Corinthians, and today we will be in 1 Corinthians 14. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co. shop or with the reading plan linked in the show notes. In today's chapter, Paul wraps up addressing the Corinthians' questions about spiritual gifts. He began in chapter 12, where he taught us that God gave many types of spiritual gifts, all for the common good of the church. In chapter 13, Paul described the greatest gift, love, and how we are to use spiritual gifts not for our own selfish gain, but in order to love one another. And today, Paul corrects what seems to be the problem in the Corinthian gatherings. The church was placing too much emphasis on speaking in tongues over other gifts of the Spirit. Paul desires spiritual gifts to be used in a way that builds the church up and honors those within and new believers. Paul writes to create order and peace within worship. Understanding Paul's motivation here helps us to make sense of these verses. Paul is very concerned with what will edify or encourage the entire church. That is why he seems to favor prophecy over speaking in tongues. Prophecy, Paul says, is spoken to strengthen, encourage, and console believers within the church body, and prophecy is understood by all present. On the other hand, speaking in tongues, when not translated, built up only the speaker and may even steer unbelievers away. In verses 23 and 24, Paul even uses an example of an unbeliever coming into a worship gathering, observing a congregation speaking in tongues, and then saying, "Are you out of your minds?" Speaking in tongues without understanding and interpretation is like meaningless sound made by an instrument. Yes, instruments can make noise, but we only consider the noise music in accordance with notes that rise and fall and are recognized. So too, speaking in tongues is merely speaking into the air unless sounds are understood and interpreted. Paul uses another example of foreign languages. If one does not speak the language of another, that only widens the gap between the two individuals. So too, tongues spoken that are not understood by others widens the gap between the believers. That's the opposite of Paul's goal by his instruction. He is encouraging the building up, the knitting together of the whole church. Paul's point is this: to be built up in faith, we have to understand what was being said. Paul uses himself as an example here, stating that yes, he does have the spiritual gifts of revelation from the Spirit, but he exercises them with self-control for the purpose of edifying other believers. He would rather teach a church with 5 words than speak in tongues of 1,000 that couldn't be understood. With this perspective in mind, the building up of the church, Paul issues his recommendations for gathering and worship. Paul sets limits on speaking in tongues, and he also suggests that there must be an interpreter present. If not, he recommends those believers keep silent during church and keep their speech between themselves and God. So too, prophets should speak in turn, not speaking over one another, but remain silent while others are speaking. Why? So that everyone may learn and be encouraged. Paul's recommendations ensure the church is reflecting the very nature of God himself, a God of peace, not disorder. And now we get into some highly debated verses in Scripture. Paul instructs women to be silent in churches. It's important to know that there's a lot that we do not know in the context of these verses. Remember, Paul seeks to build up the church that is both distracted and divided. Possibly some women were disrupting the church. Let's remember in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul acknowledges that women are praying and prophesying in the church. In chapter 11, he is not critiquing that they are praying and prophesying. He's critiquing how they are doing it. So we know that Paul does affirm women participating in worship. Therefore, these verses in chapter 14 are not an absolute prohibition against speaking in church, because that would contradict what Paul said in chapter 11. It's also important to see that women are the third group of people Paul instructs to be silent. First, those speaking in tongues without an interpreter. Second, those prophesying in turn. And third, women. In the context of this chapter, Paul is instructing order and peace within the church. It seems that likely these women were being distracting or disruptive within the gathering, just as those speaking in tongues without an interpreter would be, or those prophesying over one another. As we reflect on these verses, it's okay to wrestle. Scholars wrestle with and highly debate these verses. The wrestling causes us to think deeply about these verses in light of the context. And the wrestling helps to humble us, to help us admit that there's a lot that we simply do not know. Scholars debate these verses heavily, and it's okay and even good to admit this. We simply cannot be sure what's going on with the women in Corinth that Paul's addressing here. The bottom line of today's reading is that Paul wants a church gathering to be a place that honors Christ, that is conducive to both learning and worship. By encouraging order and peace within the church reflects the one in whom they worship. If unbelievers step into a gathering, they can then better understand who Jesus is. They get a more accurate representation of the kingdom of heaven, a place of peace and order rather than division and distraction. I love that Paul takes the love that he described in chapter 13 and he makes it practical here in chapter 14. He explains what it looks like to have a gathering of patience and kindness, a gathering that is not envious or boastful or arrogant, a gathering that is not rude or self-seeking or irritable, a gathering that does not keep a record of wrongs, a gathering that rejoices in truth. Paul describes what a gathering would look like in the context of spiritual gifts, and at times that might mean considering your brother or sister by being silent, laying down your desire to speak to make room for another. Love is self-sacrificing. That's what Jesus modeled for us. As always, we see Jesus in this chapter. We behold him. Jesus is the one who put aside his own privileges for the good of the church. In Mark 10:45, he said, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as ransom for many." Jesus came to serve. He is our forerunner, the one in whom we imitate. May we too have humility to lay aside our preferences for the good of the church. May we not get so caught up in gifts that we lose sight of the giver. May we love one another as we seek to love Christ.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.